I remember that evening with a kind of clarity that comes only when one has tried, unsuccessfully, to forget it. The rain had been falling since late afternoon, soft at first, then with the persistent, almost conversational insistence that Oxford rain possesses, as though it has all the time in the world to work on a man. I had left the station without any real direction in mind, carrying the sense of an unresolved thought behind my ribs, and I suppose that is how I found myself walking toward Jericho, letting the streets choose for me. The pavements glistened like old lacquer, and the lamps along Walton Street blurred into pale halos that trembled each time a gust disturbed their reflections. I wasn't following anything except the gentle pressure of wanting to be away from my own flat. There was whisky waiting there, and letters I had no desire to open, and a half-finished crossword whose final clue mocked me with its stubborn blankness. A word meaning to return, but not to come back. Such distinctions have always fascinated me. Sometimes they have been the only things that did. Jericho at night has a strange intimacy. The houses sit low and close, and the narrow lanes feel like corridors where one might overhear the confessions of strangers. I walked without intention, passing the bookshop where I'd once found a rare edition of Hardy, and the bakery that still smelled faintly of warmth even in the rain. My coat had begun to absorb the damp, its fabric taking on that cold heaviness that reminds you of your own poor decisions. It was somewhere near the bend by the old pub that I first heard it, a faint, stubborn ticking, far too steady to belong to anything natural. Rain has a rhythm, unpredictable and restless, but this sound cut through it like a metronome set to a private tempo. I slowed, trying not to betray even to myself that I was listening for it. The sound seemed to drift across the street, light but insistent, and when I turned, I saw an unlit window above a narrow shop front I didn't immediately recognize. I stepped closer, knowing full well I had no justification for doing so. The sign, half obscured by age and weather, read Penhaligon and Son, Horologists since 1894. Even in darkness, the letters had a faint dignity, like an old professor whose mind had dimmed but whose posture had not. The ticking grew clearer as I approached, though the shop itself was closed and its interior swallowed by shadow. There was something unsettling in hearing time so precisely measured when everything else about the building seemed abandoned to neglect. I remember murmuring something to myself about the foolishness of standing in the rain to listen to clocks that were not mine. But the truth is that the sound comforted me in a way I couldn't easily explain. Regularity has that effect, particularly on those of us who have spent years wrestling with chaos. I pressed a hand against the cold glass, feeling foolish but unable to move on. The ticking was faster now, or perhaps my pulse was simply keeping pace. A man passed by behind me, his footsteps splashing faintly, and he muttered that the place had been shut for weeks. He said it as though making an observation in a library, quiet and matter-of-fact. And I remember thinking how Oxford turns even gossip into something polite. I asked, in that half-curious, half-detached manner I revert to on lonely evenings, whether he knew what had happened to the owner. He said only that the old clockmaker had died, sudden-like, no fuss made about it. Heart, they said, or something like it. There was something in the way he added, or something like it that prickled at me, though I told myself it was merely my habit of hearing significance where none might exist. Still, as he walked on, I stayed by the window, listening to that odd solitary ticking. A shop without a living clockmaker should have been silent. Clocks wind down, gears grow tired, springs surrender eventually. Yet something inside persisted, steady as breath. I left only when the cold had climbed too far into my sleeves, but as I walked away, the ticking followed me in memory, tapping out a rhythm I couldn't quite ignore. There is a point, just before a case begins, when one feels a faint shift in the air without knowing why. I would not have admitted it then, but later I understood. That was the moment the whole business began, with nothing more than rain, an empty shop, and the stubborn insistence of borrowed time. I have been in many workshops over the years, some belonging to men whose hands shaped wood, others to those who preferred the quiet certainties of metal. Penhaligon's place felt older than either craft. Lewis and I stepped inside just after 9, and the shop greeted us with a stillness that was almost ecclesiastical. Dust lay over everything in a fine, unbroken veil, softening the hard edges of brass and steel, giving each clock the appearance of having slept through its owner's departure. The air carried a faint tang of oil and varnish, and the sound, or rather, the absence of sound, pressed in like a held breath. Lewis muttered something about museums, though he said it the way a man does when he hopes he's wrong. I didn't answer. My attention had been claimed by the far wall where Penhaligon kept the clocks he hadn't yet finished. Half-assembled pieces sat on narrow shelves, thin gears glinting like small, indifferent moons. A carriage clock with a fractured glass face seemed to stare at me accusingly. I touched the edge of the shelf and felt dust gather against my fingertip, a fragile testament to how quickly a man's life becomes historical. We found the register in the counter drawer. Ordinary enough. Neat columns, steady handwriting, dates aligned with the precision one would expect from someone who lived within the rules of mechanical rhythm. 3 names stood out. Recent, familiar to no one but the dead man. I read them once, then again, not because they meant anything yet, but because repetition sharpens intuition. It was the 4th line that troubled me. Someone had tried to strike it out. Not with the neat decisiveness of a man closing a chapter, but with the hesitant pressure of someone who feared erasing too much. Lewis leaned over my shoulder and asked if Penhaligon might have changed his mind about the appointment. I heard myself replying that the line was wrong. Too faint in places, too forceful in others, as if the hand had trembled. It suggested intrusion rather than revision. Lewis shrugged, a gesture that always carried more doubt than indifference, and left to speak with the neighbors, leaving me alone with the clocks and the silence they kept. It was then I noticed the small frame above the workbench. A quotation. I knew it was Tennyson before I finished reading the first line, but something about it jarred. One of those delicate shifts that trouble a man who reads poetry the way other men read maps. I whispered the correct line under my breath, testing the cadence as one tests the tension of a spring, and the misquotation revealed itself like a misaligned cog. A single word altered, intentional, or merely the fading memory of someone who lived more in hours than in syllables. I could not tell. I sat at the workbench and opened the file Lewis had collected from the coroner. Death by heart failure, they said. Natural, sudden, expected only in the broad sense that all things sudden eventually earn the word natural. I read it once, then again, because documents lie by omission rather than declaration. Something in the timing gnawed at me. A man like Penhaligon did not collapse at 7:30 on a Tuesday without leaving a trace in the machinery around him. Lewis returned with a few scraps of neighborly information. Quiet man. Closed shop early that week. Seemed troubled. Nothing helpful, nothing harmful. Lewis relayed it in that steady rhythm he uses when assembling facts he does not yet believe. He asked what I made of the register. I heard myself saying that the man had died in the wrong hour. Lewis frowned, but I didn't elaborate. I rarely do, particularly when the thought is still forming its edges. We lingered a while longer. Lewis asked about the clocks that continued to tick despite the shop being unattended for days. I told him clocks run until they don't, much like people. Yet even as I said it, the uneasy thought returned. Something in this place felt interrupted. A workshop holds the imprint of its craftsman, and this one spoke of a routine, broken, not concluded. Before we left, I looked once more at the misquoted Tennyson, and the erasure in the register, and the stillness of the clocks that had no business keeping time for a man already gone. Small details, each with barely enough weight to bear consideration. But I've learned that cases rarely announce themselves with fanfare. More often, they begin like this: a whisper of imbalance, a faint shift in the pattern, a wrong hour in a life otherwise ruled by precision. I stepped out into the morning light knowing only that time had been disturbed and that it would not easily set itself right again. I have often believed that the first suspects in any inquiry arrive not by summons, but by some quiet gravitational pull, as though the truth exerts a faint pressure long before we know its shape. It was Lewis who gathered the 3 names from Penhaligon's register, but it was I who insisted that we meet them in person, each encounter another stone placed along a path whose destination I had not yet glimpsed. Dr. Helena Crichton received us in her college rooms, a place lined with books whose spines glowed like relics from a long-forgotten chapel. She moved with that scholarly stillness peculiar to classicists, a grace that concealed as much as it revealed. Her eyes were the first thing I noticed. Calm, unreadable, though burdened by something that suggested an old, unspoken sorrow. She spoke with a precision that made one feel observed rather than addressed, and she mentioned Penhaligon only briefly, in the tone one uses for someone respected but peripheral. There had been an old clock in her family, she said. He had repaired it years ago. She had no recent dealings with him beyond a small adjustment requested a month earlier. Lewis questioned her gently, but she responded with the faintest tilt of her head, as if amused by the ritual. I found myself recalling the misquoted Tennyson on Penhaligon's wall, wondering if she would have noticed the error. She seemed the sort of woman who would correct a mistranslated epitaph on her own grave. When we left, Lewis asked if I believed her. I told him belief had nothing to do with it. She was a woman accustomed to tragedy, and such women learn early how to hide the tremor beneath the surface. Martin Laker was different. Blunt, restless, leaning forward as though the room itself pressed on him. His house felt cramped not by size but by the accumulation of unspoken disappointment. Unpaid bills, scattered files, an atmosphere thick with dwindling ambition. He greeted us with the forced warmth of a man who hopes cooperation will postpone whatever doom he senses on the horizon. His late wife's watch lay on the table between us, its gold surface dulled by fingerprints. Penhaligon had repaired it, he said, though he claimed it was nothing more than a sentimental keepsake. I watched the man's hands as he spoke. Restless, twitching, betraying some internal struggle. Lewis asked about his finances, and Laker admitted the obvious with a weary shrug. He was failing. Business had dissolved. Loans had mounted, yet he insisted Penhaligon meant nothing to him beyond the mechanical repair. I asked whether he had collected the watch personally. He said yes, though he took too long to say it, as though selecting the least dangerous answer. When we left, Lewis muttered that the man seemed agitated. I replied that agitation is cheap currency. Men with nothing left often spend it freely. The third visit took us through a quiet lane lined with bare trees whose branches clawed faintly at the grey sky. St. Fred's convent stood modestly behind iron railings, its façade offering no hint of the lives contained within. Sister Ruth Colcombe met us in a small receiving room that smelled of beeswax and wilted flowers. She had the kind of gentle presence that settles upon a room like settling dust. Soft, nearly invisible, yet unmistakable. She spoke of Penhaligon with a wistful fondness, describing him as a man who valued silence more than most. She had brought him an old convent timepiece for inspection, though she claimed it had required no urgent attention. Her answers were soft, almost fragile, and yet beneath her serenity I sensed a careful evasiveness, like someone arranging memories into acceptable shapes. I asked if she had visited him recently. She folded her hands in her lap, hesitated, and said only that she had meant to. When we stepped back into the cold afternoon, Lewis asked what I made of her. I said that gentleness is sometimes a mask, and sometimes a confession, and that the trouble lay in knowing which. We returned to the station with the three names circling my thoughts like wandering stars. Helena with her quiet intellect and unspoken grief. Laker with his desperation and untidy truths. Sister Ruth with her softness, her half-finished sentences. Each had touched Penhaligon's life in some small way, and each carried a detail that did not entirely fit. I spent the evening staring at the register again, the crossed-out line whispering something just out of reach. 3 who came before, I muttered to myself. But one of them had come closer than the others. I simply had not yet learned how to hear the difference. There are clocks that refuse to die even when every rational thing within them has surrendered. Penhaligon kept one such creature in the far corner of his workshop, a tall, long-case clock whose dark wooden frame bore scratches like old battle wounds. Lewis and I returned there late in the afternoon, the light outside thinning into that pale grey that belongs uniquely to Oxford winters, and I suppose I felt something close to anticipation as I approached it. Some clocks, like some people, resist silence with a kind of stubborn pride. Lewis had been sorting through the drawers while I wandered toward the long case. The glass pane over its face was cracked, and the minute hand hung at an angle that suggested violence rather than neglect. I reached inside, pressing my fingers along the brass rim, and felt the faintest rustle behind the chimes. It was not the sound of machinery. Paper has a different fragility. I slid my hand deeper and pulled out a folded sheet creased into a weary triangle, as though someone had tried repeatedly to make it smaller. It was a letter, or what remained of one. No salutation, no signature, just a few tight lines written in a hurried, slanted hand. The words spoke of guilt, of something done long ago, of the impossibility of undoing it. No names, no accusations. Only a sense of confession offered into a void. I read it twice, then again, feeling the rhythm of the sentences falter in places where a hand must have trembled. Lewis asked what it said, but I told him only that it spoke in half-truths, which was more or less accurate. This case seemed determined to give me fragments rather than explanations. Lewis then mentioned something that had been troubling him. He'd found a small pile of correspondence, mostly mundane, but tucked between them were 2 envelopes addressed in an unfamiliar script. The messages inside used phrases so technical that even Lewis, who prides himself on understanding the basics of machinery, seemed baffled. Pendulum variance, escapement anxiety, counter-locked adjustments. At first glance, they looked like specialized notes exchanged between craftsmen, but I felt immediately that they were something else. Code hides most naturally within the familiar. I asked when the letters had been sent. Lewis said the last one had arrived only a week before Penhaligon's death. He frowned when he added that the return addresses were false. He had checked. I remember thinking that the simplest lies are the ones most carefully wrapped in precision, as though the liar hopes the neatness will absolve him. Lewis waited for me to say more, but the room felt heavy with unformed thoughts, and I let them remain that way. We stepped outside for air, though the cold did little to sharpen things. A vendor on the corner was selling copies of the Oxford Mail, and as I bought one, a crossword clue in the corner caught my eye. 8 letters, hands that move backward to tell the truth. I folded the page and tucked it under my arm, feeling the odd satisfaction of a metaphor too pointed to ignore. Truth often demands a reversal, a journey into the past, not to reclaim it, but to see which part of it still pulses. Back in the workshop, I studied the long case again. If Penhaligon had hidden the letter there, he must have believed someone was watching him closely enough to search the more obvious places. I ran my finger along the inner lip of the casing and felt a faint indentation, like a mark left by a tightened screw. Someone had opened it before. Someone who either knew what they were looking for or hoped the clockmaker had kept more than secrets inside. Lewis suggested we should take the clock back to the station for examination. I told him no, at least not yet. A thing must be observed in its natural environment before it can be understood. Remove it too soon and whatever truth adheres to it begins to thin. He didn't argue. Years with me have taught him that my instincts, however irritating, rarely wander without purpose. As we locked the shop behind us, the light had dipped into that colorless dusk that always seems older than night. I found myself repeating the crossword clue in my mind. Backward hands. Truth waiting in reversed motion. Something in this case was inverted, bent against its proper direction, and somewhere in the folds of that worn letter, in the coded phrases Lewis had found, and in the silent defiance of the long case clock, was the faint outline of a story, trying quietly to be heard. I've always found something faintly unsettling about college archives. Perhaps it is the way the past settles there like dust on neglected manuscripts, each page holding the faint, persistent suggestion that its contents were never meant to be disturbed. Lewis called me from the station that morning with a tone that carried the kind of restrained urgency he adopts when he knows my patience for theatrics is limited. Penhaligon had once been an assistant archivist at St. Athanasius College, he said. Dismissed quietly 30 years ago. No reason provided? We walked to the college under a sky the color of tarnished ivory. Oxford seems to grow more introspective in such weather, as though its stones too prefer to think in private. The archivist on duty, a young man with anxious eyes, produced the personnel ledger after some hesitation. There it was. Penhaligon, Arthur James. Employed briefly. No remarks, no commendations. Then a line drawn through his name with the deliberate pressure of someone asked to erase without quite understanding why. Lewis asked whether dismissals were usually so elegant. The archivist said such matters were handled discreetly, particularly when reputations were involved. I watched his hands as he closed the ledger, careful, precise, slightly trembling, and felt a small disturbance inside me. Men don't simply vanish from archives, they vanish from memory, and that is a far more deliberate act. On impulse or instinct, and sometimes I think the two are indistinguishable, I walked to Helena Crichton's rooms. She received me with a quiet courtesy that felt rehearsed. Her posture remained composed, though her eyes flicked toward a stack of papers on her desk as though I had arrived at an inconvenient hour. I mentioned the archive casually, or at least attempted to. Something tightened in her expression, a faint constriction at the corners of her mouth, almost imperceptible. She asked why it mattered that a clockmaker had once worked among manuscripts. I replied that men carry their pasts with them even when they've forgotten to check the weight. She turned away to pour tea, her movements graceful, deliberate, and said Penhaligon's departure had nothing to do with her discipline. I had not suggested it did. She then added too quickly that some people found archives oppressive, that the silence there can breed unease. Her voice trembled only on the word silence. A scholar with command of Greek tragedies should not stumble over a single syllable, unless the subject being spoken of was no longer academic. I left her rooms, without further questions. Sometimes the best interrogation is simply to be present, long enough for discomfort to reveal itself. The rest of the day settled into one of those slow descents into evening I know too well. My flat felt colder than usual, though the radiator clicked and hummed with mechanical goodwill. I opened a bottle of wine, more out of habit than desire, and allowed Wagner to fill the room with its heavy, brooding architecture. Music is the closest thing I have to religion, though its hymns often leave me more unsettled than comforted. I sat in the half-light, replaying the details of Penhaligon's life as though sifting through an unfiled manuscript. A man excised quietly from a college, A clockmaker who hid confessions inside broken casings. Letters written in coded phrases about movements and reversals. A long case clock that had refused to surrender. Something about it felt staged. Not merely the man's death, but the shape of his life leading up to it, as though someone had constructed a narrative for him, one where every event appeared plausible until examined under a less forgiving light. I poured another glass of wine and considered the folded letter found in the clock. There had been something deliberate in its placement. Not panic, not haste, a kind of grim ceremony. The past returns only when invited, and Penhaligon, it seemed, had issued an invitation. I reached for the crossword from earlier that week and noticed a clue I had ignored. 7 letters, meaning to uncover by removing what was added later. An archaeologist's term, or perhaps an archivist's. I felt the faintest stir of recognition, a whisper at the back of my mind assembling itself into coherence. And then the phone rang. Stranger's voice arrived with its usual mixture of authority and weary patience. There was something he needed to discuss, something about the timing of Penhaligon's collapse. I told him I'd been thinking about time all evening. He chuckled, assuming I meant it as a joke. I did not. As I hung up, the thought that had been forming finally settled into place. Something had been altered in Penhaligon's past. Not erased, not forgotten, but rearranged. A man dismissed quietly, a life continued noiselessly, and somewhere in the gap between the two lay the first true shadow of the truth. The room had grown darker. Wagner's final chord lingered like a held breath, and for the first time I felt the case turn slightly in my hands, revealing a new face I had not yet seen. There are moments in an investigation when a suspect's shadow grows long enough to touch everything else, and for a brief, misguided span of hours, one begins to believe the case has assembled itself neatly. Martin Laker became such a shadow. His debts, his bitterness, the restless tremor in his hands, all of it coalesced into a shape that felt satisfyingly dark. Even Lewis, who rarely leaps to conclusions, admitted quietly that Laker's temper could ignite given the right provocation. I allowed myself to think the same, though even then a faint doubt threaded its way through the conviction. We brought Laker to the station that morning. He sat heavily, as if gravity had singled him out for special punishment. He spoke in short, resentful bursts, insisting on his innocence while revealing, in the very tension of his posture, how little he trusted the world to believe him. His late wife's watch, he claimed, had been a simple repair. He needed it fixed, yes, but the sentiment was the only value left in it. Yet when I asked whether he had collected it on the day he claimed, he hesitated. Only a second, a fraction of one. But hesitation is a language of its own, and I've grown fluent in its grammar. Lewis questioned him about his finances, and Laker's responses unraveled quickly into frustration. He said the world had taken enough from him, that a man trying to keep his business alive shouldn't be treated as though he'd committed a sin by failing. He almost rose from his chair at one point, his voice edging toward something sharp, before collapsing back with a muttered apology. Lewis shot me a glance that needed no words. This was a man with heat in him, irrational, directionless heat, and such men do desperate, foolish things. For most of the morning, I permitted myself to believe we had our culprit. The broken clock, the hidden letter, the coded correspondence, Penhaligon's sudden collapse. A man with motive, with volatility, with opportunity. I convinced myself the threads formed a rope. But a rope, when pulled too quickly, reveals its weak fibers. It was nearly dusk when I revisited the register. I'd looked at that crossed-out line a dozen times, perhaps more, but something in the fading light made it appear altered, as though the day's testimony had pressed new meaning into its smudged strokes. Laker's timeline rested upon the assumption that he visited Penhaligon when he said he did, an assumption I'd accepted far too easily. I compared the date and hour he had given us with the probable time of death, and a small, cold realization settled in my chest. The hours did not align, not even roughly. If Laker had been there when he claimed, he would have found Penhaligon already dead. False hour, false heart, I murmured, feeling the kind of weary embarrassment that comes from recognizing one's own haste. I walked through Jericho until I reached Helena Crichton's college. Not because I believed she held the key, but because I needed to see someone who lived in a world governed by precision of thought rather than the messy impulses of failing businessmen. She opened the door with her usual composed detachment, though tonight her eyes carried a trace of something sharper, curiosity or apprehension, I couldn't tell. I mentioned the archive dismissal again. A barely perceptible tension moved through her, like the tremor of a string pulled taut. She spoke in riddles, as she always did, weaving quotations into her replies as though emotion required the safety of another writer's words. Some truths lie buried not in dust, but in silence. A fine sentiment, though delivered with a quiet urgency that unsettled me. I asked whether she had known Penhaligon beyond the clock repair. She answered indirectly, stepping toward the window, letting the dim light carve her features into something sharper than elegance. She spoke of regret as though it were a language she once mastered and no longer wished to practice. The conversation circled itself, never landing, never quite dispersing. And underneath it all, an ache I recognized too easily. The ache of someone carrying a private weight. When I left her rooms, the evening had grown colder, and the stones of the quad radiated a kind of ancient fatigue. I paused under the archway, feeling the investigation shift inside me like the turning of some unseen gear. Laker had been a distraction, a convenient silhouette cast against the more complicated machinery of the case. The crossed-out line in the register no longer felt peripheral. It had become the quiet pulse of the mystery. An erased appointment that someone had tried, with clumsy insistence, to bury. As I walked back toward the station, the bells in the distance struck the hour. A correct hour, one that aligned with the world. And I felt, with a faint, unwelcome clarity, that the truth I'd been pursuing had only just begun to move. The convent lay at the far edge of Jericho, where the town's murmurs quieten into something more contemplative, as though even the air observes a rule of silence. Lewis and I walked there in the late morning, the mist clinging low to the pavements and softening the outlines of everything. Oxford does silence well, but convents refine it into something like discipline. As we passed through the gate of St. Frideswide's, I felt the curious sensation that time itself had been coaxed into moving differently. Not slower, exactly, but with less urgency, as if each second hesitated before committing to existence. Sister Ruth greeted us in a small vestibule that smelled faintly of beeswax and the tired fragrance of flowers, left too long in still water. She folded her hands with the serenity expected of her vocation, but her eyes betrayed a vigilance that made me think she had rehearsed our visit long before we arrived. Lewis asked about the old timepiece she'd brought to Penhaligon. She nodded gently, offering a description that was precise in all the least revealing ways. An heirloom, functional enough, needing attention in ways that were not, apparently, urgent. When I asked if she'd known Penhaligon before his days as a clockmaker, she looked away. Not abruptly, but with a softness that felt carefully arranged. She said only that Oxford is small, and lives intersect more often than people realize. Evasive answers often come wrapped in kindness. One must listen, not to the words, but to the space between them. We were shown into a narrow library where hymnals and devotional texts lined the walls in obedient rows. The place felt suspended in its own era, untouched by the rest of the city. I drifted along the shelves, while Lewis continued his quiet interrogation. The spines were worn, many repaired with the sort of delicate stitching that suggested the convent prized preservation over replacement. It was a small, leather-bound hymn book that drew my attention. Its pages were swollen slightly from age and handling, and as I thumbed through it, something slipped out. A fragile sheet tucked between two psalms. An old photograph, blurred at the edges, as though time had run its fingers across it too often. Penhaligon stood in it as a young man, hair darker, posture straighter, the faintest attempt at a smile hovering on his lips. Beside him stood a woman, or rather, the outline of one. Her face had been scratched out with an insistence that felt both angry and despairing. The marks were rough, made by someone without the patience or the emotional distance to act with restraint. When I showed the photograph to Sister Ruth, she pressed her palm to her chest as though steadying something that had shifted inside her. She said she didn't recall seeing it before, and the lie was so gentle, so courteous, that I almost admired its craftsmanship. Lewis asked who the woman might have been. Ruth lowered her eyes. She said some things belonged to the past, and the past, when stirred, often bleeds into places where it shouldn't. The phrasing was delicate, shaped by someone used to choosing words that soothe rather than reveal. Yet the tremor at the edge of her sentence was unmistakable. We walked the cloister afterward, the mist seeping through its arches like a quiet intruder. The stone beneath us glistened faintly, and our footsteps echoed with a softness that made the whole place feel unmoored from the present. I trailed my hand along the cold wall, feeling the texture of centuries press lightly against my fingertips. It struck me then how easily lives disappear into institutions like this, how reputations, sins, and heartbreaks can be folded into hymns and rituals until only the most persistent truths leave a trace. I thought of Penhaligon, dismissed from the archive, resurfacing years later as a clockmaker, hiding confessions in long-case mechanisms, corresponding in coded phrases. And now, this photograph, its violence so at odds with the quiet order of the convent. Someone here knew him long before his tools and gears replaced whatever he once guarded among manuscripts. Lewis asked what I made of the scratched-out face. I told him that erasure is rarely about the erased. It is about the eraser, and whatever memory becomes unbearable to hold intact. He muttered that the whole place felt as though it were keeping a secret. He wasn't wrong. As we left, the convent bell struck a single note. Soft, almost hesitant, and I felt time shift again, like a breath held too long. Something about our visit had unsettled the stillness, nudged a dormant truth awake. I walked back through the mist-filled cloister with the uneasy certainty that we had stepped into a past not yet finished with us. The discovery of the unsigned will came to me not through a dramatic revelation, but through the quiet diligence of a college administrator who seemed faintly apologetic for existing. She produced the document from a manila folder worn at the edges as though it had been handled more often than anyone wished to admit. Penhaligon had drafted it himself, in careful handwriting that wavered slightly at the descenders, as if the ink carried the weight of something unsaid. And yet the signature line at the bottom remained empty, an unfinished promise, or perhaps a decision deferred. Lewis leaned over my shoulder as I read. He pointed at the intended beneficiary, and I saw immediately what had lit his eyes with premature certainty. The initials H.C. He muttered that it made sense now. Helena Crichton, the brilliant classicist with the unreadable expression. I heard the eagerness in his voice, the satisfaction of seeing disparate threads tie themselves neatly, and for a moment I almost envied him. Cases seldom present themselves with such tidy bows. But the moment passed. I told him the handwriting bothered me. Not the content, but the shape of the letters themselves. The H was too ornate, its loop curved in a style inconsistent with the rest of Penhaligon's script. The C leaned forward at an angle that suggested a hand unfamiliar with the pen. Lewis frowned, insisting that people sometimes write differently under stress. He wasn't wrong, but stress usually renders writing smaller, tighter, not embellished. It felt staged, a deliberate misdirection crafted by someone who wished us to look in a particular direction without questioning who held the lantern. We left the college and stepped into an afternoon that felt prematurely autumnal. The air carried a faint chill, and the sky had that soft, exhausted grey that makes Oxford appear older than it already is. I found myself thinking of Helena as we walked, the way she balanced intellect and sorrow with such quiet precision, the way her eyes seemed always half-occupied with some private calculus of regret. Lewis had seen potential guilt in her restraint. I had seen something else entirely. Loneliness, the kind that folds itself carefully into one's mannerisms until it becomes indistinguishable from composure. I told Lewis we needed to revisit her, though I disguised the urge as professional necessity. He accepted the explanation with a shrug, unaware that I'd already begun rehearing her voice in my mind. The soft elegance of her quotations, the way she spoke as though answering a question posed decades earlier. She received us in her rooms once again, the afternoon light falling across her desk in thin, deliberate bands. I showed her the will, or rather the photocopy of it, and watched closely for any flicker of recognition. She studied it with the calm interest of a scholar examining an unfamiliar manuscript. She said she had no knowledge of Penhaligon's intentions and seemed almost embarrassed by the implication. When she handed the page back to me, her fingers brushed mine lightly. Not enough to be called contact, but enough to leave its echo. Lewis asked if she had ever been close to Penhaligon. She gave a soft, almost wistful smile and said that closeness was a word scholars tended to misuse. She added that some relationships were defined not by presence, but by echoes. Lewis looked puzzled, but her meaning, vague as it was, settled heavily inside me. As we left, I noticed a book lying open on her table, a volume of Catullus, the page marked by a small slip of paper. The line facing upward spoke of unreturned affection, of a heart given without expectation of its return. I'm not sure why it struck me so deeply, only that I felt an ache stir beneath my ribs, the kind that accompanies memories one has spent years negotiating with. Back at the station, I examined the will once more. The initials continued to trouble me, not because they pointed to Helena, but because they seemed designed to. A second red herring, placed with enough finesse to satisfy a casual glance. The rest of the script felt authentic. The slight tremor in the downstrokes, the careful spacing of the clauses. But those initials, they were theatrical, self-conscious. An archivist would have known the importance of authenticity. A clockmaker even more so. Lewis asked whether I believed Helena was innocent. I told him innocence was the wrong metric. What mattered was truth, and the truth rarely aligns itself with our suspicions. He pressed further, asking why I trusted her. I said nothing, because the reasons were neither logical nor defensible. Later, alone in my flat, I poured a small glass of whisky and sat in the dusk, thinking of Helena's solitary grace, of the will that felt like a staged confession, and of the peculiar ache that had taken residence somewhere behind my sternum. It occurred to me then that the case was no longer moving forward in a straight line. It was circling itself, like a clock whose hands turn with purpose, yet refuse to reach the hour that matters. It was late when I returned to my flat, later still when I finally admitted sleep would not be coaxed into visiting. The case had begun to fold in on itself with that peculiar insistence of puzzles nearing their point of inversion. I poured a measure of whisky, smaller than I wanted, larger than I needed, and sat at the table where the hidden letter lay open like an accusation. The lamplight trembled faintly, as if conscious of intruding upon something private. I read the letter again, slowly, carefully. Each line a whispered confession, each phrase trembling under the weight of something unsaid. I had studied it before, of course, but fatigue has a way of smoothing the edges of perception. Clarity often arrives only when the mind is too tired to defend itself. Somewhere between the second and third reading, a single word shifted in my awareness, no more dramatically than a falling leaf. Yet the shift unsettled me in a way that felt both intimate and unfamiliar. The word was sorrow, except it wasn't. The original line had read, "I could not bear the sorrow of what happened." But tonight, under the strained glow of the lamp, I noticed something in the pen strokes. A faint pressure change where sorrow had been overwritten atop another word. Not erased, not replaced cleanly. Altered, a linguistic graft, a classicist's solution. Helena's voice drifted through my memory. Her careful enunciation, her fondness for quoting lines slightly askew as though meaning were a negotiable truth. A scholar might change a word not to deceive, but to refine, to soften, to place a veil over something raw. And suddenly I saw it. The overwritten word had originally been shame. The distinction pierced me with quiet precision. Sorrow was a feeling. Shame was a wound. I leaned back, letting the whisky warm the space beneath my ribs. The misquoted Tennyson line from Penhaligon's shop came rushing back. A line altered by a single word, its emotional resonance bent into a different key. I had dismissed it initially as human error, the kind of lapse committed by a tired craftsman, but the alteration in the letter echoed it too perfectly to ignore. Someone with both motive and scholarly instinct had handled these words. I stood and walked to the window. Oxford's lights glittered beneath the mist, a constellation scattered across stone. The bells at St. Giles marked the hour with a solemnity that felt earned. Time, faithful as ever, announcing its presence even when human lives faltered beneath it. The register had troubled me for days, its crossed-out line whispering a story I had refused to hear. Tonight, the whisper grew sharper. The erasure had never been Penhaligon's. Its hesitations were too irregular, its pressure too uncertain. He was a man who lived within precision. His redactions would have been confident, economical. This one bore the clumsy urgency of someone trying to conceal, not correct. I took out the photocopy Lewis had made. The crossed-out appointment, faint, uneven, frantic, seemed to pulse under the lamplight. Someone had wanted the name obscured, yet not so thoroughly that the act itself disappeared. Almost as though they wished to suggest Penhaligon had changed his plans, when in fact someone else had done it for him. The killer, I thought. But that word felt reductive. This wasn't merely a killing. It was an excavation of a past buried too hastily. The archivist's dismissal decades ago. The scratched-out photograph. The coded letters, and now a word overwritten in a confession more fragile than truth. I saw it then. Not the solution, but its outline. A shape formed by absence rather than presence. Penhaligon's past had intersected with someone who feared the return of an old scandal, someone who understood the power of words and the vulnerability of memory, someone who knew how to rewrite. The connection had been in front of me for days. I simply hadn't listened carefully enough. I poured the last of the whisky and let it settle against my tongue. The bitterness steadied me. I thought of Helena, her poise, her loneliness, the carefully arranged distance in her eyes. I had mistaken composure for containment. A classicist hides wounds in literature the way others hide them in silence. And yet guilt does not always equal culpability. Sometimes it merely clings to those who have brushed too closely against another's ruin. The room felt colder as the hour deepened. I folded the letter carefully, as though handling a fragile relic. The minute hand on my mantel clock ticked toward the next hour, with the stubborn honesty of machinery. It was the minute hand, after all, that had lied in Penhaligon's long case clock, poised at an angle that never belonged to natural decay. A hand moved deliberately out of truth's alignment. As the clock struck midnight, I knew with a weary certainty that the past had been altered, not forgotten. And someone had hoped time itself would not notice the difference. There is a particular stillness to early evening in Oxford, a moment when the city seems to wait for its own history to pass through again. I felt that stillness as Lewis and I approached the convent once more, the mist gathering in low, hesitant strands along the paving stones. The bells had not yet begun their hour, but the air carried the faint expectation of them, as if time itself were holding its breath. Sister Ruth received us without resistance. She stood in the same small room where we had first spoken to her, though today her serenity felt worn at the edges, as though the veil that shielded her composure had frayed overnight. Lewis remained by the door. He sensed correctly that whatever needed to unfold required a quieter audience. I laid the photograph on the table between us. Penhaligon young, hopeful, unaware of the machinery of sorrow that would one day claim him. And the woman at his side, her face scratched out, erased not with anger alone, but with a grief too intimate to be spoken. Sister Ruth looked at it and lowered her eyes. She asked if we had found what we needed. I told her that sometimes it is not what one finds, but what one finally admits to seeing. She sat then, slowly, as though fearing the chair might recoil from her. She said the woman in the photograph had once been someone else. Not a nun, not a figure formed out of prayer and silence, but a young archivist's sister who had made one unforgivable mistake. A forged document, a correction that had no right to be made, a deception carried out not for profit, but for love of someone unworthy of the gesture. Penhaligon had discovered it, quietly, methodically, with the instinct of a man who understood the honesty of records because he had so little honesty left in his own life. He had confronted her, she said, not with cruelty, but with sorrow. He wanted her to confess, to make amends, to erase the lie by acknowledging it. But shame, she whispered, has its own gravity. It pulls a person inward until all decisions made under its weight become distorted. She told us he came to her again weeks before he died, said he could no longer carry the burden alone, that the truth had to surface. She panicked. The word emerged like an old injury, long set but still aching. She followed him to the workshop. There was an argument, subdued, desperate. She told him she would confess. He turned from her, and then, in a moment she could not name without trembling, she struck him. Not hard, not to kill, simply enough to make him sit. But he fell. There are deaths that have no drama in them, only the terrible simplicity of chance. She thought no one would look too closely at a man of his age dying alone in his shop. She placed him in the chair where he sometimes rested, arranged his tools, pushed the minute hand of the long case clock to disguise the hour of his collapse. She crossed out her own name in the register, the strokes uneven with panic. She wanted, she said, to erase every trace of connection between them, past and present, tethered to a mistake she had never forgiven herself for. Lewis asked why she hadn't run. She said, "You don't run from shame. You carry it until someone stronger takes it from your hands." She looked at me then, with an expression not of pleading but of resignation, the look of someone who has long awaited the arrival of consequence. We took her out through the cloister. The air smelled of damp stone and the faint metallic scent of approaching rain. Helena was there, standing at the far end, as though she had been waiting for the conclusion she already suspected. Our eyes met briefly. She offered a small, sad recognition. Not approval, not judgment, merely the acknowledgement of a truth neither of us could soften. Ruth paused as she was guided into the car, her hands bound with gentle formality. She said that Penhaligon had been a good man, better perhaps than she had deserved, and that time had never forgiven her for what she had hidden. As she was driven away, the first bell of the hour began to sound, precise, unwavering, indifferent. I stepped into the evening, hearing clocks strike the hour with a precision human beings never achieved, and felt, not for the first time, that I had solved everything except myself.